World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. Still to come on our program, Chinese Premier Li Keqiang on a mission to restore good neighborly ties with Japan. We will weigh in on improving relations between Beijing and Tokyo right after this break. You're watching World Insight, coming to you Monday to Friday on CGTN. I'm Tian Wei. Chinese Premier Li Keqiang is paying an official visit to Japan at the invitation of Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. He also attended the 7th China-Japan-South Korea leaders meeting. So what is the future of apparently warming relations between China and Japan after quite some time? And what is the significance of resuming the China-Japan and South Korea leaders meeting after 2.5 years? Before our discussion, take a look at this.
Chinese Premier Li Keqiang is the first Chinese premier to set foot in Japan in 8 years, coinciding with the 40th anniversary this year of the signing of the China-Japan Treaty of Peace and Friendship. China and Japan held bilateral talks this afternoon. Li stressed China and Japan should firmly comply with the principles and consensus of the 4 political documents signed by both countries to bring bilateral ties back on the right track.
Recently, relations between China and Japan have improved and have stabilized. My visit to Japan is to get bilateral ties back to normal and make sure that our relations will continue to be healthy and stable.
Bilateral ties reached a low point in 2012 due to Tokyo's provocative moves on territorial and historical issues. The downward trend began to reverse itself in late 2014 when the two sides reached a 4-point agreement on handling relations. Last year, trade between the neighbors returned to above the $300 billion mark, while people-to-people exchanges rose to a record high of 10 million. Tokyo has also recently expressed its openness to the Beijing proposed Belt and Road Initiative.
This year is a milestone as it marks the 40th anniversary of the conclusion of the Treaty of Peace and Friendship. We hope to make this year as a new start of Japan-China relations.
The bilateral meeting between China and Japan took place right after the China-Japan-South Korea leaders meeting. As Premier Li proposed, China, Japan, and the ROK should carry out joint projects through a new cooperation mode called the China-Japan ROK plus X. The 3 countries are at the forefront of development in Asia and should make full use of their respective advantages to jointly open the 4-party and even multi-party market to push the development of Asia.
For a discussion on the Chinese Premier's visit to Japan, we are joined in our Beijing studio Rong Ying, who is the Vice President of the China Institute of International Studies. Sir, welcome to our program.
Okay.
Great to have you here. In Tokyo, Japan, we are joined by Takasato Watanabe, who is a Professor Emeritus at Doshisha University. Professor, what a pleasure to see you too. Let me begin by asking you, Mr. Rong. So, after a long time, finally the 2 countries got together, the prime ministers, while at the same time 3 countries, Northeast Asia, China, Japan, and South Korea, be able to talk to one another. What is likely to be the most concrete result, do you think, of these rounds of interactions?
Of course, the most important result is the very fact that finally, in 2.5 years, the 3 leaders sit together, the meeting, which is supposed to held annually on a regular basis. And the reason, of course, is known to all, is because the political relationship, in particular the 3 countries, not only China and Japan, but also China and South Korea, and South Korea and Japan.
Yes, it's very complicated for
exactly.
quite some years.
So far, the relationship shows, the meeting itself shows that finally the relationships have come back to normal.
But having said that, though, there are 2 things people are looking at. One is the economic issue, trade as well, among these 3 countries, between China and Japan particularly. The other thing is the DPRK nuclear issue. Remember, these 3 countries are all members of the 6-party talks earlier, and certainly their interest likely to have a direct impact on the final result. So on these 2 fronts, how much do you think the three will be able to work together? Which is likely to be easier for the three to work on?
Well, the trilateral cooperation, the idea started with, economic and trade, but gradually I think there's a realization that after all, there's such an important cooperation mechanism has to take into account, has to consider the other issues, particularly peace and stability, security issues. North Korea's nuclear issues is one of the most important issues that for regional security.
Okay.
And the very fact that, of course, the easing of the tension, the meetings between the inter-Korean meetings, Korean summit, and more importantly, I think the coming meeting between North Korea and the United States looms large. So at the meeting, the three leaders came up with a statement to welcome the development, and more importantly, I think they agreed that how to pursue the settlement or resolution of these issues in a way. So I thought that was a very positive, I think,
development. Yes, Professor Watanabe, from Japan's perspective, what about trade? There is the free trade agreement that has been long discussed among the three countries, China, South Korea, and Japan. And yet, because of political reasons, being delayed and the quality of discussion not necessarily meeting the expectation, will it be able to come back on track? What kind of timetable, Professor Watanabe, shall we look at?
Japan, China, and South Korea, they have the very similar purpose to bring the peace and historical understanding these days gradually. However, we have another problem against North Korea. But economically, you see, those four countries can go hand in hand, and also they should go hand in hand. However, Japanese Prime Minister Abe, he had a very different understanding, or I dare say some ignorance about historical past. Now you see people, government, and also the state, country, should be organized together. However, in China, people's idea is different from the understanding of Japanese Prime Minister, who denies even a Nanjing massacre.
Yeah.
This is wrong.
Right.
So
it is wrong. It is wrong, but Professor Watanabe,
so
if we could think about the fact that the three countries are already coming together, they are discussing. The question is, to what extent will they be able to discuss, and will they be able to achieve some kinds of mechanism regarding the free trade talks? Professor Watanabe, do you think there is a timeline that we should look at, or this is mainly still political difficulties is going to take the precedence of anything, even the three have got together?
For the economic development, I think to some extent, three countries can go hand in hand, because you see, besides a summit talking among three, we have, and also South Korean sent economic leaders. Practical, you see, level talkings are going on. So this doesn't produce any big problems, because they are economic circles people. But government must consider economic development together with the people's support. So I think this brings some delicate matter. And in addition, for the security of East Asia, North Korea is coming. So Mr. Abe wants to make the good success among three countries' summit talks, but it is not expected to be successful from the peoples and media in Japan.
I see.
This is frank view of myself and also the media people in Japan.
I see. Mr. Rong, however, we see new development. For example, China and Japan are talking about establishing a council, quite a formal mechanism of China-Japan dealing with the issues regarding earlier China's initiative about Belt and Road Initiative, meaning Japan and China has the possibility of working together in some ways regarding investing and working on infrastructure projects in other parts of the world. What do you make of that new development, Mr. Rong?
Indeed, this is a very positive development in terms of the bilateral relationship. And it's also, I think, could become a new point of growth for China and Japan to pursue their economic trade relationship under the new circumstances. I think if you look at China, as we know that the China's economy is undergoing a kind of transformation, focusing more on quality, while Japan itself is also having difficulties, how to restructuring for that. So this is where China's initiative, the Belt and Road Initiative, come into play, even though at the very beginning, for political reasons, the Abe administration had strong reservations on oppositions even. But gradually, I guess, pragmatism, prevail, and
right.
more importantly, the business community in Japan and realize that this is a good opportunity. This is where I think Japan and China and Japan can work together for the benefit of the relationship.
I see. But Mr. Rong, on the other hand, what about the trade issue? As I mentioned earlier to Mr. Watanabe, we see the free trade discussion should have started much earlier, and yet it finally did. On the other hand, the RCEP is also a topic being discussed by the three leaders. Between China and Japan, how far are we from seeing eye to eye about the issue?
Yeah, I think the trade issues is much more, complicated to some extent. That is, if we look at the logic of economy, and we have all the reason to believe that China and Japan, of course, plus South Korea, should work earlier, work out the agreement earlier for drawing for the FTA. But unfortunately, I think this is the part here that politics that comes into play. If you look at Japan, I think while it is going working with China and South Korea on that FTA negotiation, it's also working with TPP and others. So I think from Japan, that this is a question, I think, which would come first. And more importantly, I think it is also related to so-called rulemakings. Now the Japanese have finally come to realize that, of course, they got that so-called CPTPP, but more importantly, I think come to realize that excluding China or is not going to work. And or in other way around, if I can say that Japan, if really want to make, have a say in the so-called rule-making and free trade and rule-based sort of trading system, multilateral system, you have to bring into China into play.
Well, Professor Watanabe, earlier you heard the Chinese guest, Mr. Rong, talk about several mechanisms, CPTPP and also RCEP, free trade agreement, and as well as some of the other things Japan is looking at. What about the priorities? I'm sure Japan has to set a priority. How would that work for Japan? Mr. Watanabe.
For Japan, FTA is very important. And also, Japanese government and the economic circles here, they are confident in making the rather big agreements among three, China, Japan, and South Korea. This is not a big problem because in China, they are producing things that Japan cannot, produce, and vice versa. And Korea is a little behind, but their economy is not bad. So three countries can help with each other. This doesn't have the big problems, except the security problems. If North Korea comes in, the problems would be very much complicated. But as far as three countries, China, Japan, and South Korea, practicality among three are in the same way. So I don't worry anything about this point.
All right. But Mr. Rong, it is not the first time that we see so-called breaking the ice. The relationship between China and Japan once cooled down, and eventually there is a time, or there was a time, that things are getting better. this is not the first time, this is not the second time, this is not the third time either. We see that repeatedly, periods of better relations and then cooling down. Very dramatic. So, Mr. Rong, what are we seeing right now? Is it likely to be a continuity, or this is likely once again to be repeated, the earlier, shall I say, sad and tragic trend of the bilateral relations?
I hope not. And I think that possibly this time will be different. First of all, as we all know that the relationship between China and Japan has undergone some changes in the sense that Japan has more or less come to the realization that China's rise is a reality. And dealing with a rising China is something I think Japan has to accept. And more importantly, I guess, Japan realized that the past few years, particularly during the Abe administration, that a stable relationship between with China serve its best interest. So I think if you look at the agreement between two leaders, you will find that they all agree that the political trust is important, principles that has been followed, but more importantly now they are also talking about how to explore practical cooperations and manage differences and conflict in a constructive way.
Okay, Rong Ying, Takasako Watanabe, what a pleasure to have both of you for being with us. That is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us, World Insight CGTN, into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching, and tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Good night.